All right. So my name is Christopher Furnari. I am here with Rich Rubino. I know him as the guy that walks around Marblehead, Massachusetts, and enlightens me about the world of politics. Other people might know him as an author or a political expert. Rich, for those folks out there who don't know who you are, tell us, what you're all about.
Well, I'm a political author. I've written four books. The latest book is American Politics on the Rocks. I'm very interested in kind of the trivial side, the lighter side, if you will, of American politics. I'm a former blocker for the Huffington Post, and I do some radio analysis on a station, St. Louis, with in KMOX with on Overnight America with Ryan Recker, and also a show that airs Monday mornings. I have a segment called The Straight Dope with Rich Rubino, which appears on Ocean 98.1 in Ocean City, Maryland. And I'm frequently appear with Hank Stoltz on WCRN in Worcester and do some radio analysis. So that's kind of that's basically that encapsulates it, I think, in that nutshell.
And now you get to give Rich Rubino's rundown to a guy in his basement who is just trying to make sense of what the heck is going on right now because it's been a crazy,
Oh, yeah.
48 hours really of news. And I'm a news guy myself. I mostly write about the alcohol industry and businesses. So the world of politics, is something that I'm familiar with. It's something that I follow loosely. Certainly not an expert like yourself. So here we are 1 month out from the election. Our president, Donald Trump, is hospitalized at Walter Reed Medical Center. And it sounds crazy to say this, but like the future seems the most uncertain it's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, really saying something in 2020. So walk us through sort of the next 30 days as you see it, and the possible scenarios of what happens if President Trump falls ill, or even worse, if he dies before the election. What happens?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There's always a term called an October surprise, meaning something that's going to come out in October that very few people actually expected. For example, back in 1992, there were indictments that involved some administration officials from Ronald Reagan. This was when George H.W. Bush was running for re-election. And it brought people to remember Iran-Contra and George H.W. Bush, what his role was in it. So that was an October surprise. And then in the 2004 election, Osama bin Laden issued a tape where he excoriated the U.S. about a week before the election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And some believe that it was that Osama bin Laden actually wanted George W. Bush to get reelected because he saw him as an adversary that could really galvanize Sunnis and Shias toward Osama bin Laden. And then so George W. Bush ended up winning the election. And then there were other instances. Certainly James Comey and the announcing that he was continuing the investigation of Hillary Clinton back in 2016, but nothing quite like this. So basically, by the way, there have been examples where people have died prior to an election, but not an actual president or a presidential candidate. Go back, for example, 1892, Benjamin Harrison's wife died on October 25th, about a week prior to his election. So the result, the Democrat Grover Cleveland and Harrison himself basically put a moratorium on campaigning, but Grover Cleveland ended up winning that election anyways. Benjamin Harrison later got remarried. So basically what's happening in terms of with Donald Trump, so let's say that Donald Trump if he were to pass away, theoretically, and that's a big if, and I don't think it's actually going to happen, but if that were to happen, basically with the political parties who nominated him, and they're not part of the Constitution themselves. They have their own kind of way of nominating. They basically have committees, and the committee would select somebody to supplant Donald Trump as the de facto nominee. Now, basically, I think most people, and by the way, this could happen on the other side too. If Joe Biden were to pass away, essentially most people would say, well, Kamala Harris is the running mate, so she would probably be the logical successor. Although it's certainly not written in stone, and there are probably some people in the Democratic Party high command that might have certain incredulous or skeptical attitudes toward her. So somebody else could make the case that they want to be the nominee, and theoretically that person could become the nominee. So that's basically what happens. I mean, this is obviously, we're going to outlandish scenarios right here. Now, what happens if the president gets reelected and then before? So, by the way, when you're voting for a set of electors. You're not specifically voting for somebody for president. It's not a popular vote. where you're saying this person against this person. What you're doing is you're saying, I want these electors to select the person that's going to be next president of the United States. And that election does not happen until January 6th. So after the election, you're going to hear the term president-elect. If Joe Biden were to win, they're going to call him President-elect Joe Biden. He's not technically president-elect until January 6th. The proper term would probably be something better than that, something more interesting, I guess you'd say, like non-president-elect apparent, or president-elect apparent would probably be better, something to that effect. So there is one example, and this was back in 1868, where Horace Greeley lost in a landslide election to Ulysses S. Grant that year. Now, Horace Greeley was the opponent of Ulysses S. Grant, and he lost after losing that election. He died, and essentially what happened was he had a 66 electoral votes. Didn't matter much. Some of them awarded to his running mate. Some of them awarded to other minor candidates who would run for the Democratic nomination that year. So that's basically what happens if he were to pass away. What would probably happen is that the electors who favor Donald Trump would probably select Mike Pence. And by the way, what happens is, generally speaking, is the vice president-elect would become essentially president. And that actually goes back to the 20th Amendment. There's a provision in that. So that's essentially what would happen.
So there's basically no chance where we could sort of redraw this thing in a scenario in which one or even both candidates were to pass away. They couldn't say, there's too many ballots out. About 3 million people have voted, I think, already by mail. So there's not a situation where we're not going to the polls on November 3rd.
No. Barring a cataclysm, if, for example, there were to be some sort of a if there was to be a catastrophe in the country, for example, go back to 2012, Superstorm Sandy, there was a possibility that New Jersey could have theoretically delayed the election. But these are outlandish scenarios. And I think generally this election is going to be decided no matter what happens. There will be people voting between certainly the early voters and certainly those going out in November as well.
Okay. So I guess the feeling that I'm getting from you is that we're moving forward one way or another.
Yes.
It's very likely that if one of the candidates does pass away, it'll be the vice president running mate that gets put up as the presidential nominee or candidate in this case. And then, I guess, what do you make of, on either side, either the Democratic or the Republican side, especially the Democratic side, where there were so many people vying for the presidency this year? Mm-hmm. Do you think that in a scenario where Joe Biden is unable to run for president, someone like Bernie Sanders could say, well, hey, what about me? I was the next guy up.
And there's certainly, what Bernie Sanders has that Joe Biden does not have is he has supporters that will essentially fight to the death for him. And there will certainly be some people who would do that. My guess is that he would not succeed. Remember, you're talking about the Democratic high command. Those are generally people who, they may be ideologues per se, they may be left wing, but they also want somebody who's going to be seen as electable. I think that a lot of them are more realists, and they do not believe that Bernie Sanders would be the electable nominee. So my guess is they would view Senator Harris as more or less kind of the de facto candidate, would probably support her instead. Now, the question is, would Bernie Sanders actually want his name? Would he want his name out there? He's been vociferous in supporting Joe Biden. But you're right, theoretically, that could happen. Other candidates as well. You could have somebody that potentially there could be some boomlet where someone could say, well, how about Gavin Newsom, the governor of California? I like how he's handled the corona thing. Why don't we put his name in there? And that theoretically could happen as well. It is interesting because, remember, Senator Harris, she was certainly not the favorite of the Democratic establishment. She was the person who Joe Biden chose. But there were very few members of the high command, establishmentarians in the Democratic Party, who actually endorsed her candidacy. Even Dianne Feinstein, for example, the other senator from California, she endorsed Joe Biden over Senator Harris. And Senator Harris also she had her own foibles. She had her problems in the African-American community. She registered a very low amount in the African-American community, whereas Joe Biden was absolutely was just creaming her. It was really a shellacking within that community. But I do think that Senator Harris would become essentially the nominee and would become the next president should Joe Biden win.
So in this very unlikely scenario that one of the candidates does indeed fall ill or die and is unable to move forward, Do you find the Democratic side to be a little bit more interesting than the Republican side? Because it seems like what you're saying is that Pence will just be the nominee. There's a little bit more uncertainty on the Democratic side.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I think the uncertainty, it's de minimis. It's very small, the uncertainty. The Democrats this time around, their goal is to win. You know, you always have an election like that. You can either nominate somebody who's an ideologue or you agree with politically, or you nominate someone who's going to win. For example, go back to 1992. The Democrats had lost 3 elections in a row. In 1980, they only won 6 out of 50 states. In 1984, they only won 1 state. In 1988, they only won 10 states. So the Democratic Party in that primary, they had liberal options. Tom Harkin, for example, the senator from Iowa, said he was a quote unquote no apologies liberal and called himself the only real Democrat in the race. The Democrats that year, they wanted to win, and they were willing to do just about anything to win. So they nominated Bill Clinton, a Southern moderate governor who literally left the campaign trail 2 days before the New Hampshire primary to preside over an execution in Arkansas. And they were willing to. I mean, they were willing to essentially compromise nominating someone more liberal to nominate someone who is more electable. You know, the Republicans have had their certainly scenarios too. After 1964, Barry Goldwater was the nominee, only won his home state of Arizona outside of the Deep South. For 1968, the party went back to the center, nominated Richard Nixon. 1972, George McGovern was the running mate, someone who wanted to get out of the Vietnam War pretty much immediately, wanted to give everyone $1,000. And essentially, he won 1 state that year. By 1976, a moderate Southern governor in Jimmy Carter. This is an election that the Democrats do not want an ideologue. They want somebody who can beat Donald Trump. And essentially, they do not really care about their ideological certitude, about their ideologic being recreant to some points of the Democratic Party. So they would probably not want Bernie Sanders' name on that ballot because they know that the Republicans would immediately say, you're voting for Bernie Sanders, you're voting for a socialist. And the word socialist has become a term of derision, certainly in the United States, although you can make the case that he's more of a social democrat in the European sense. But he's somebody, it's more or less what Bernie Sanders really favors is essentially great society, New Deal liberalism. But the bottom line is they would rather have Senator Harris than Senator Sanders.
All right. So the Democrats want to win. I will write that note down. That is a key takeaway. They don't want to lose.
Yes. That's what you call politics 101. That goes to the very elementary level. The basic goal of politics, you see, is you have a winner and you generally have a loser. And generally speaking, this is something you learn in political science classes. The goal is generally to be ahead. And then when you're ahead, what happens is eventually you win. And might notice many times in gubernatorial elections, elections for Senate, Cemetery Commission, usually the candidate gets the most votes tend to be the one that wins, and they're usually the ones that's usually advantageous for them to be the actual victor.
Thank you for helping the guy in his basement understand that fully. So let's switch gears slightly. Let's just think about the last 48 hours and everything that's transpired. How does this change the election moving forward? The fact that Trump has been hospitalized. He was riding around in a Suburban a few hours ago, waving to people outside of the hospital. So it's really unclear. Everything's changing by the hour. So it's unclear what he's going to be doing tomorrow. Is he going to be leaving the hospital? Is he going to be going back to the White House? Is he going to be able to debate? But just from the 30,000-foot view, how does this, the fact that he has the coronavirus, change the rest of the election?
I think actually very little. This is a base election, and it's really a referendum on Donald Trump. Donald Trump does not have very many fair weather supporters. The people who would support Donald Trump will go full throttle for Donald Trump. On the other side, Joe Biden, he does not have as many vociferous supporters, but there are a lot, although he does have some supporters, certainly, for example, in places like the Midwest that may have voted for Trump last time that see him as more or less a tribune of the blue collar voter. But Joe Biden does not have those vociferous supporters, but he does have a lot of people who are saying, we want somebody other than Donald Trump. So if you're talking about persuadable voters, you're really talking about like 5 to 6% of the electorate in the 11 or 12 battleground states. And there's very little that I think would try to think of your average Trump supporter, or for that matter, your Biden supporter, and try to think of any of them saying, well, because of the health, I'm going to essentially go one way or the other. Whereas in such a bifurcated time with our electorate right now, that it's very hard to imagine somebody actually switching from one side to another. Now, that makes it very hard for Donald Trump. And that's why I think you listen to part of his strategy. When you listen to him in the debates, he doesn't try to go after the center. He does it's very similar to what George W. Bush did in 2004. Karl Rove that year said, we need to have a base strategy. We need to bring out as many members of the conservative base as we potentially can. And the Republican side, that's what Donald Trump's trying to do. He's just trying to maximize as many conservative voters, as many populist conservative voters, folks who have not voted in past elections, to come out for him. And he thinks he can win that way. Whereas the same thing, by the way, with Joe Biden, just there are so few persuadable voters.
Interesting. One thing that I was thinking about today is, the fact that he has the coronavirus and that we know so little about the long-term effects of the coronavirus. If you're somebody who's still considering voting for Donald Trump, does that ever enter the equation? Thinking about, well, what happens? Sure, let's say he's fine and he's reelected. In a year from now, does he have more health complications because he's contracted this virus? Now, does that ever enter somebody's mind when they're headed to the ballot?
Very few people. There are some low propensity voters, people that don't follow politics on a daily basis, that are kind of peripheral interested in it. Those are those few persuadable voters. It might affect those people. But in terms of for Donald Trump supporters, they realize that if it were to be a health issue, if he were essentially to pass away, then Mike Pence would likely take over, and the policies would be pretty similar between Mike Pence and Donald Trump. So it's very hard to envision a scenario where somebody actually goes from one side to another. Now, theoretically, you could have a scenario where somebody maybe would vote for the Libertarian nominee, somebody who perhaps is not as religiously oriented as Mike Pence, who might say, well, I'm really trying to trepidatious that Mike Pence is going to take over and Mike Pence is going to turn the country into some sort of a, theocracy to some extent. But we're really talking about folks on the margins right now. And I think that's very few voters.
Interesting. Before Trump was hospitalized, there was talk about his tax returns. There was talk about the Supreme Court nominee.
Yep.
There were all these other things that started to enter the picture in the final 30, 40 days. How do those figure into the election moving forward? It seems like they're kind of on the back burner now.
Yeah, no, this is the cloud to just about everything else. In terms of the Supreme Court nomination, this is one of those issues where conservatives who do not like Donald Trump, who have an antipathy for Donald Trump, in the last election, he came out. So normally what happens is a Republican will come out and they'll ask the question, for example, with the person you nominate for the Supreme Court to the Supreme Court, will they have to be somebody who agrees to overturn Roe v. Wade, the decision which basically legalizes abortion in the first 2 trimesters of a pregnancy. George W. Bush in 2000, for example, said, we want constructionist judges, but he would not say specifically about what type of a case. In 2016, a lot of religious conservative voters supported either Ben Carson, Ted Cruz, or another Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee, Rick Perry, somebody other than Donald Trump. So what Donald Trump said in that election, he said basically there's going to be a list from the Federalist Society of people who I would possibly nominate to the Supreme Court, and every one of them is somebody who he believes will overturn Roe v. Wade. So that brought a lot of these people to him. Now, this election, very similar. He had a list from the Federalist Society. Amy Barrett was somebody that was that was supported certainly by the anti-abortion community, and they realized that they realized that they are potentially one or two, perhaps one vote away in the United States Supreme Court from a court that a conservative majority that could actually liquidate the decision of Roe v. Wade and return abortion decisions to the states. So because of that, a lot of religious conservatives, they may not like Trump personally, but they're going to support Trump essentially anyways based on policy. So that's why, normally for the average voter is probably not thinking about who the United States Supreme Court nominee is going to be. It's just not really a bread and butter issue. But for the people the folks in the religious right specifically, they're going to come out and they're going to say, we're going to come out because of this issue, even though we may have some antipathy for Donald Trump.
Now, it's not just Donald Trump that has the coronavirus. It's, plenty of people who were at that event, that Supreme Court nomination event. a lot of senators, a lot of Republican senators. What do you think happens to the Supreme Court nomination now? And is that something that kind of gets derailed until the lame duck session, or was it always going to be that way?
No, yeah, I think you got to remember some members, Tom Tillis being one of them. Remember that the members of the Judiciary Committee, if they're not there because of coronavirus, they can still participate essentially via Zoom. This is a flagship issue for conservatives. If Lindsey Graham, for example, who's the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, someone that the conservatives have always been skeptical of until Donald Trump became president, and since Donald Trump became president, he has been Donald Trump's tribune. Lindsey Graham, for him to win re-election, he cannot do anything to alienate any of those conservative voters in South Carolina. And coming out talking like, for example, a statesman saying, if everything is going on, we have to do this in the lame duck session, or let the next president decide who the Supreme Court justice is going to be. There would be an elephantine backlash in the state of South Carolina against Lindsey Graham, which potentially she could actually lose his reelection bid. Now, a lot of people will look at it and they'll say, how does Mitch McConnell, when Lindsey Graham, when they were saying something different in 2016 for the case of Mitch McConnell and the case of Lindsey Graham in 2018, were they afraid of being seen as a hypocrite? Well, not really. I mean, remember, so Mitch McConnell's up for re-election in Kentucky. Kentucky's a state that went for 30 points for Donald Trump last time around. Mitch McConnell knows that conservatives, national conservatives who are giving money to Mitch McConnell, who always viewed him as kind of an establishment figure, somebody who was not really a Trump Republican, he knows that they don't care that he's a hypocrite. And he knows that most religious conservatives in Kentucky do not care if he's a hypocrite either. Lindsey Graham knows the exact same thing. For them, what really trumps, no pun intended, is the fact that they could actually get somebody on the Supreme Court who would be an originalist, and they can actually get, essentially a 6-3 conservative majority. It's really kind of the ends justifies the means, and it's very hard to envision to think of anybody who's actually lost an election simply because people thought of them as a hypocrite. They would say, well, essentially the ends justifies the means, and I think that certainly trumps all.
So you think that the appointment will move forward prior to the election?
Yeah, I always found the appointment term very interesting, by the way. I know that people use it, but technically when you're appointing somebody, you're appointing a chief of staff, for example, you don't go through confirmation, but you're actually nominating the person. But I hear this all the time. You're nominating the person, then the United States Senate is going to confirm him. And it's going to be very interesting. It's going to come essentially down, assuming, and it's interesting, all Supreme Court nominees come out and they say, I'm going to be some sort of an impartial arbiter. I'm just going to look at essentially the cases on the merits, and I'm not going to determine it based on ideology. And there are some examples where that's actually happened. For example, David Souter, George H.W. Bush's choice, was considered a conservative. John Sununu, the chief of staff, former governor of New Hampshire, recommended him. When he went on to the Supreme Court, he became essentially, he became a lot more liberal member. Dwight Eisenhower nominated Earl Warren, Republican governor of California, the party's vice presidential nominee with Thomas E. Dewey in 1948. He came in the Supreme Court, and then he moved further to the left. And Dwight Eisenhower was later asked what his biggest mistake in terms of his presidency was. He said, yeah, he's on the Supreme Court. Then Richard Nixon, who was the vice president, when he ran for president in 1968, made that an issue, talking about the Warren Court. So there is a possibility, but the vast majority of justices, if you're appointed by a Republican president, you're probably going to have a conservative temperament. If you're appointed by the Democratic president, it's probably going to be center left. And what we're probably going to see in terms of the nomination, with the exceptions of Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, every solitary Republican is going to vote for her. Every solitary Democrat, including the most conservative member, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is going to vote in the negative, and then Mike Pence is going to break the tie. Wow.
Seems like you've got this all mapped out. You've got it all figured out. But these are the issues that people are talking about. One of the things that, I always wanted to pick your brain on, and then the news, just took a hard right off of the highway a couple of days ago was, just your reactions from the debate earlier this week.
Oh, I remember that.
And it wasn't so much a debate. It was a kind of a shouting match. But, did that help or hurt either candidate, and did it sway any voters one way or the other?
Yeah.
And I guess looking ahead, what do you think the upcoming vice presidential debate will look like, and possibly future debates between Joe Biden and Donald Trump?
Yeah, I do think the presidential debate, I think, had deleterious effects. I think it hurt Donald Trump, certainly on the margins, because, very few voters are actually undecided in this election. First of all, he made a huge faux pas by essentially trying to downplay Joe Biden and try to essentially underestimate Joe Biden, come out and say, I don't believe Joe Biden even going to show up. Basically, generally speaking, in politics, you're supposed to increase the expectations of your opponent, not lower them. And then when they come in, people are shocked that they didn't do as well enough job as people thought they were going to do. In 2000, for example, great example, George W. Bush versus Al Gore. The expectations were that George W. Bush was going to have a poor performance against Al Gore. You looked at his last, when he ran for re-election as governor of Texas in 1988 against Gary Moreau, the land commissioner. Moreau probably had a better performance, and he was really kind of somebody that very few people had heard of. The thought was George W. Bush is really not going to perform anywhere near where Al Gore performs. So the debate comes up. Al Gore probably actually performs a little bit better. People are saying, wow, George W. Bush, I'm actually impressed. He didn't do nearly as bad as people thought he was going to do. In Joe Biden's case, I don't think it was necessarily an exemplary performance for Joe Biden, but he came, and it was certainly an adequate performance. It was satisfactory. It was probably an average performance. In Donald Trump's case, the next day, all anyone essentially was talking about was, why did Donald Trump interrupt? What was his ultimate strategy? Was it potentially to try to get Joe Biden off guard, which he certainly was not able to do. And then certainly there were other instances. All this is beclouded now, but there were instances, for example, when Joe Biden was talking about his son, Beau, who had passed away, and then Donald Trump, without giving, even a pro forma, we all feel sympathy for your son, something to that effect, immediately started talking about Hunter Biden's business impropriety. So I don't think that necessarily benefited Donald Trump whatsoever. But the first debate, generally speaking, the incumbent president usually loses, because they've never really been, it's been a long time rather since they've actually been on a platform mano a mano with one candidate, where they're not necessarily, kind of put in a pedestal. 1984, Ronald Reagan against Walter Mondale. The only time I think in that election where anyone legitimately thought Walter Mondale might actually win was that first debate, when Walter Mondale performed better than Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan seemed lost in his thoughts. He lost his train of thought. Then he came back in the next two debates and performed certainly as well as Walter Mondale, ended up winning 49 states. 2012, Barack Obama really took that debate for granted. A couple of days before the election, instead of going out and practicing, he went out and looked at the Hoover Dam because he was kind of bored of it. And then he had that first debate with Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney probably overperformed. And then after that debate, Barack Obama literally came in to his campaign staff, and he apologized for his performance and said he'd have a better performance in the next 2 days, and he did. And here's an interesting one. In 1960, so Richard Nixon made this, what was the most ill-fated, dull-witted promise probably in American history. He said, I'm going to go out and I'm going to campaign in all 50 states. All 50 states. Remember, very few were actually swing states. So, we get to the point where a couple days before the election, you have to literally go up to Alaska. But to make that, he made that promise. So he's campaigning vigorously to try to perform that. There was one instance where he was in Greensboro, North Carolina, and he suffered a staph infection. And then so he was taken off the campaign trail for a few days. And there was the other instance that literally the day of the first debate, he was out campaigning, where John F. Kennedy was out getting a tan. So as a result, it really landed up hurting him. But, Donald Trump certainly, in terms of debate-wise, assuming that he's copacetic health-wise, certainly does have time to recover.
Well, he's got plenty of time to prepare if he's just hanging out in the hospital, and he's as well as the doctors are purporting to his health to be. We just got a couple more minutes. You mentioned, swing state, the battleground states. What are the key states this year?
Yeah, it's pretty much. So let's go to basically the only states that Hillary Clinton lost last time that Donald Trump potentially could win this time. New Hampshire, where Donald Trump has a laser focus on New Hampshire. He came within, essentially a whisker close election in New Hampshire. He's spending a lot of time in New Hampshire. Joe Biden. I think the thought in part is because he performed so poorly in the Democratic primary, literally coming in 5th in New Hampshire. The thought is Donald Trump may actually have a chance there. The other state is probably Nevada, where I think Donald Trump thinks he has a chance there, very close. On the other side, though, so Joe Biden, he needs to siphon off states that Hillary Clinton won last time. Florida, most important state, and the most important state. No Republican has ever won the presidency without carrying the state of Florida since Calvin Coolidge defeated John W. Davis back in 1924. At the time, Florida was somewhat part of the Deep South, so it was kind of the Democratic Party domain. Joe Biden has a very slight lead right there. If Joe Biden wins Florida, it is very hard to envisage a scenario where Donald Trump can win the election. Ohio, no Republican has ever won the presidency without carrying the state of Ohio. Right now, it's about tied. It's a state that's been kind of tailored. It's been going further and further Democrat. Bill Clinton carried it twice. Barack Obama carried it twice. Last time around, Donald Trump carried it. So I think that's a state that certainly Donald Trump needs. Joe Biden does not need Ohio, but Donald Trump certainly does. Joe Biden has been spending an inordinate amount of time in Pennsylvania, talking about his roots, the fact that he was born in Scranton, spent his first 2 years in Scranton. Pennsylvania is a very interesting state. It's, you got Pennsylvania, you got Philadelphia here, Pittsburgh here, a few college towns, and those, it's a very, very conservative part of rural Pennsylvania. It's like James Carville, the campaign strategist, said, you got Pittsburgh here, Philadelphia on the other side, you got Alabama in between. So a very interesting microcosm of the country. And then you have, Wisconsin, where Hillary Clinton took for granted last time, the state that every Democrat had taken going back to Bill Clinton. And so she did not spend any time campaigning there. Donald Trump was able to pull out a win. Oh, one more state that Hillary Clinton won last time, Minnesota. Minnesota, specifically the Iron Range part, is becoming more and more Republican. There's one congressional district that Donald Trump literally won by 30 points last time. The northern part of the state where Colin Peterson represents. So those are some of the states that we're essentially looking at. And obviously it's going to come down to Florida.
All right. Well, thank you so much for enlightening me, Rich. And people can find you where?
Yeah, you can find me a couple things, www.polita-geek.com, or find me on Twitter at Rich Rubino, Rubino Paul, or certainly just find me on Facebook, and you can see some of my recent interviews there as well.
Awesome. All right. We'll have to do this again sometime.
Indeed.
Cheers.
There's more at the store.